If the Denison Forum podcast is an instrumental part of your understanding of today's news, culture, and faith topics, please consider a summer campaign gift to Denison Forum. We're looking to raise $474,000 by the end of July so that we can continue our work and keep expanding our efforts to be digital salt and light to a culture in need of both. If you stand with us, please give today at dfpodcast.org and know that any gift today will be doubled by a generous matching grant of $75,000. Visit dfpodcast.org to partner with us today. Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, the Executive Director of Denison Forum, and the host for today's conversation. At Denison Forum, we are seeking to provide transforming content that's Christ-centered, that will equip you to be a transforming, culture-changing Christian, to be salt and light as Jesus called us to be. And we hope today's conversation will help you do that. I'm excited to introduce to you, welcome to our podcast, Dr. Preston Sprinkle. Sprinkle is the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and a New York Times best-selling author. He's written more than a dozen books, and those books include the very popular People to Be Loved, an award-winning book on faith and homosexuality. Preston and his wife, Chris, live in Boise, Idaho, with their 4 kids, and Dr. Sprinkle has been a very significant and rising voice within the church about issues of confused and broken sexuality. I actually used some of his resources in a doctoral project that I did a few years ago. I'm excited to introduce him to you and to have this conversation about his most recent book that is coming out called Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? 21 Conversations from a Historically Christian View. I think you'll find this conversation to be fascinating, helpful, clarifying, and strengthening as you seek to walk with Christ and to represent Him in all of your opportunities and relationships. Dr. Preston Sprinkle, welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. We're thrilled to have you.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited about the conversation.
Yeah, and as I was sharing with you before we got on air, just greatly an admirer of your work, and really have been blessed by it. And we'll share a little bit more about that as we go along. But you've got another book coming out, and we're excited to talk about that. The book is entitled, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? And then the subtitle's intriguing as well, 21 Conversations from a Historically Christian View. Now, I've read a number of your books, used some of your material in small group settings and in other things that I've been a part of. I know that you've written various parts of this already. What's new about this book?
Yeah. So back in 2015, I published a book called People to Be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue. And it was my kind of holistic approach to the question of the Bible and homosexuality as a whole. Had a lot of, biblical investigation, probably 70% was, looking at the Bible, more in a kind of deductive manner, and also weaving in a lot of just questions around, gay identity and what does it mean to have, be gay and or same-sex attracted and also believe in Jesus? What does that look like? And many other kind of pastoral questions. So it's kind of a holistic approach to the question of the Bible and homosexuality in the church. So since then, 2015, I've done a lot of speaking, different churches, conferences, leadership forums, and everything. And over the last, 7, 8 years, I've gotten a lot of questions, right? Like, what about this? What about that? Kind of pushbacks to various things I've said. And so over the years, I've kind of kept a mental list of what are some of the main counter arguments to the traditional view of marriage, one man, one woman. So this book is basically that. It's kind of People to Be Loved. My previous book kicked up a lot of dust, and this book is kind of responding to maybe at least the theological and biblical portions of that dust. So it is more narrowly focused on wrestling with the arguments that are often used to disagree with the traditional marriage or to advocate for same-sex marriage by using biblical texts as their argument. So by most of them, there's some more just general like love is love. Is that a valid argument for same-sex marriage and other ones? So yeah, that's where this comes in. I was originally going to do kind of a series of blogs, kind of
Hmm.
responding to all of the main arguments, but then someone said, "Well, that's great. It's free, but it's like it'd be way easier if someone had a nice, somewhat short, accessible,
Yeah.
one-stop shop where they can go to for this." So that's where the book came in. So
Almost a field manual, at least from a pastor's perspective, maybe
that's
something
kind
that
of
you
what's
can.
kind of the idea. It was
Yeah.
more designed almost like a reference book. I mean, it's organized to where you could read it cover to cover. In fact, I've had early readers say they read it cover to cover and they loved it. But it's also designed to be yeah, if you want kind of a quick, go-to response to, the argument that for instance, I'm sure we'll get into some of these, but like, in the ancient world, consensual same-sex relationships didn't exist. The nature of same-sex relationships back then was non-consensual, was older men
Right.
with having sex with younger teenage boys, or prostitution, so whatever Paul's prohibiting, it can't be what we're talking about today, two people falling in love, same status, same age,
Right.
so I think that's conversation number 4 or something, so
Yeah.
uh yeah, so if somebody has a specific question that somebody threw at them and they want a quick go-to response, it's designed for that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just paint the background a little bit more in the event that some of our audience is not familiar with the larger scale of your work. The previous book, "A People to Be Loved," the great thing is about that is the personal nature of this. That these are people that we're talking about, people that we know, people that we care about, or at least we should care about, and not simply an issue to try to figure out who's right or most right.
Mhm,
But I'm curious, what's the backstory of
mhm,
how you came to found and be the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and
mhm.
Gender?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that there was never a day when 20 years ago you said, I'm going to become a biblical expert in sexuality." That
No, that
doesn't
was
sound like
not what I signed.
that was not the plan when you were in college. I don't think.
No, it was not. No, it was not. No, no. I sort of fell into the conversation in researching and writing my book, People to Be Loved. And I mean, that book really captures a kind of almost a personal journey of like, what do I think the Bible says about this topic? I knew what I grew up believing, but I feel like I've been on a 25-year mission to figure out what does the Bible actually say about all these topics. Like rather than just
Right.
absorbing or assuming certain things that I grew up believing. I want to make sure I know what the Bible says. So this, questions around sexuality and marriage were part of that journey. And for me, it started just as a interesting theological question, but I quickly got into relationship with LGBT people, talked to them, listened to them, heard their stories, found out that the overwhelming majority of LGBT people were raised in the Christian church and had a really bad relational experience, not just
Mm.
certain theological disagreements, although that's can be there too, but the relational experience they had was on many levels just pretty bad to horrifying, in some
Right.
cases.
Yeah.
So that's a long story. Like I am both passionate about getting the Bible right, understanding this on a theological level, but also embodying the radical grace and kindness and compassion of Christ toward a group of people that, as I've learned, have not experienced that for the most part from most or many churches. So all that, so that led to well, to answer your question, I was teaching at a Bible college all throughout writing that book, but moved to Boise, Idaho, started an extension campus for that Bible college. That didn't lasted a couple years, didn't really get off the ground, and so I was kind of out of a job. Now I had already been doing a lot of traveling and speaking and writing on the topic kind of on the side, but this made kind of created a perfect opportunity for me to figure out a way to do this full time. So in 2017, me and some friends started the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender. So that's been my full time job now since 2017. helping the church engage LGBTQ related questions with theological faithfulness and courageous love. So grace and truth, the twin pillars I see in this conversation.
Yeah, and such great work coming out of there. Not only books, but courses that can be used in small group or church settings. And then you also have a podcast that I'd highly recommend to people called Theology in the Raw. Just love the name, which is uh, largely about issues of sexuality, but not exclusively. Right? You take up
Right.
other topics
Yeah.
and talk about
Yeah.
various
I try
things
to
as well.
do, I try to keep the sexuality podcast episodes to try to do like less than 20% just so I do address, other topics. I feel like in the month of July, it just so happens that there's a lot of sexuality episodes coming out. But
Right, right. Well, one of the things, Preston, that I've greatly, I think really was the thing that drew me toward your work once I kind of bumped into it was just the tone and the spirit by which you come at these very important and very difficult, very emotionally charged issues. And anybody that's uh, been in anywhere close to this,
mm,
if you've had personal experiences, as I was sharing with you, I've got a number of people in my life at very close levels that are gay, and some of them in gay relationships, and even considering marriage in that regard. But what I've always in the last 5, 6, 7 years since I came across your work, just the spirit of compassion, both
mm,
joy, just general joy as a believer. I've never yet had any experience where you were speaking or doing a podcast or anything else where there just wasn't a lot of joy in it, because that's just seems to be the spirit that you have. But a great desire to say, you know what, at the end of any conversation, we may not agree. We may not be any closer in our
mm,
beliefs theologically than what we were, but hopefully we will be better friends, no matter who
yeah.
you're talking to. And that's what I heard in the way you described this book. That the very first part of the book is about a foundation of setting yourself up for healthy conversations with people who don't necessarily see the world as you do from a
Mm,
biblical standpoint. Can you kind of unpack that?
yeah.
What is that first part, that first pillar of the book really about?
That's yeah. I'm personally am probably most excited about that first chapter because it's something that I've thought for years. I've read on, and also just intuitively in my decade now in this conversation. You pick up things that like, oh, this is an effective way to approach this topic, and this really isn't effective. And so I was really happy to put that all into a chapter, put it on, as you know, when you get ideas in your head or whatever, it's in you,
Right.
but until you get it on paper, it's kind of you haven't like worked out all your thoughts. So yeah, the first chapter or there's two foundations and then 21 short chapters where I deal with the argument. So the first foundation is how to have a profitable conversation. The second foundation is just laying out what is the historically Christian view of marriage, so we know what it is others are even arguing against, maybe. So
Right.
yeah, the first chapter, how to have a profitable conversation. I draw from a lot of psychologists who have studied kind of the nature of belief. Why do we believe things we do? Why do you one of my favorite psychologists, Jonathan Haidt, he wrote a book called the Righteous Mind, subtitle Why Good People Disagree on Politics and Religion. One of my hands down favorite books. But he
Yeah,
talks
I
about,
love him.
like
Yeah.
why could you get two good people, two smart people that are looking at the same facts and come to widely different conclusions on this? And so he unpacks why that is, and it ends up leading really helpfully to helping us understand if you're actually are trying to maybe change someone's mind, or you want them to actually consider a different perspective, you have to kind of understand the nature of belief. So those kind of questions go into that first chapter. How can we have a profitable conversation? So I talk about various principles like, um, are you a good listener? Like, are you actually listening to someone else's viewpoint? Doesn't mean you agree with it. I mean, their viewpoint could be toxic, could be terrible, but
Sure.
until you genuinely listen to it and are curious about it, what makes you think they're going to do the same to you? Like, don't you want them to do that to you? Be curious about what you actually believe, and actually be able to repeat back to you what you actually believe. Well, we need to do that to other people, be able to understand something before we refute it. Even the last principle I talk about in the opening chapter, you know, not being overly confident or dogmatic in your viewpoint. And I even in my podcast I talk about, Gen Xers like myself and boomers like my age and older. This
Yeah,
is
you're
really
talking about me.
counterintuitive.
Yeah, it
Oh,
gets a
you're
little
okay.
personal. You start talking
I
about
don't.
me. I'm 60,
I don't want
so
to assume.
yeah, you're
um,
stepping on my toes a little bit for sure.
okay. Okay. Well, I think I even said, I'm a Gen Xer, which but I feel like I think like a boomer a lot of times. Like I have
Well,
that.
you let us boomers be the judge of that, Preston.
Okay. Okay. But the kind of like 100%, when a preacher was like 100% certain and would preach the truth and black and white. And I mean, I was groomed on John MacArthur and John Piper and these bold,
No,
loud, the louder the yell, the more I believed them. Like that's how I'm wired. But I've learned, having 4 Gen Z kids and working with a lot of younger people, it's just that is not compelling to them at all. I've seen it happen over and over and over again. If you're come off very black and white, very overly confident, they get suspicious. They're almost like, I don't trust this guy. But
yeah.
if you demonstrate some like, what, here's where I'm at in my journey, and but there's good people who do disagree with me, and they're smart, and you should consider different viewpoints. But here's why I believe what I do. If you have a much more gracious and humble approach, your viewpoints are actually way more believable. So
Hmm.
this is where some people misinterpret kind of me being kind or trying to be understanding is like being weak, or you don't really have conviction or whatever. It's like, no, actually it's the opposite. I'm not only do I have conviction about the truth, but I actually want other people to believe that. But I
Yeah.
know that the manner in which we go about this is really significant for positioning people in a place where they can actually consider what you're trying to say. So anyway, so the first chapter really could be written, you know, regarding a book on politics. It could be written on climate change. Like
Yeah.
any contentious issue, we need to, I think, learn how to have maybe better, more fruitful conversations. So.
Well, when I hear you talk about that, it really goes again back to what drew me to your ministry years ago, which is, for us at Denison Forum, we hardly have a conversation or a day that goes by that we don't quote Ephesians 4:15 of speaking the truth in love.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
we want to be radically committed to the truth as the Bible reveals it and as God gives us the ability to understand it, just unapologetically. And many Christians, maybe all people, are that way. They want to be committed. They want to know the truth. They want to be committed to the truth, but to then try to share it. Not it's what you described in some of the things that I saw and heard about this first part of the book is it's almost like a practical guide for how to live Ephesians 4:15.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and some of these things we've heard before. I can remember Stephen Covey talking about the principle of seeking to understand before you're understood.
Mm.
That listening principle. So
Yeah.
some of these things, like I said, are not just unique to this very emotional conversation of sexuality, but really apply in other places. It's just how to be a person who can witness and share and talk to people with the goal of having a loving relationship rather and possibly winning their way of thinking to your biblical
Mhm.
understanding. Um,
Yeah.
but but even if it doesn't result in that, it still
Mhm.
results in a healthier relationship where there's respect. It's almost kind of like when you were talking a minute ago. It's like, okay, well, this is the living out of the golden rule in conversation.
Yeah.
is is this the
Yeah,
way you'd want to
exactly.
be? Yeah. Is this the way you'd want to be treated if somebody was talking to you about something that they thought you were wrong about? Right.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, if you're not curious about somebody else's viewpoint, what makes you think they're gonna be curious about yours? So a lot of this, and that's I didn't think about it like that. The golden that's exactly what it is. It's what does a golden rule look like in these kind of tense conversations? And it's not only do I believe it's way more effective for having a profitable conversation and getting somebody to consider your viewpoint. Like it's
No.
again, my ultimate goal is I want all of us to embrace the truth, and I mean, this sounds arrogant, but it should be a no-brainer, but, like, I think my beliefs are true, otherwise I wouldn't believe them, right? And somebody else
Right.
might
Yeah.
think the same thing about that. But I want people to see the truth, and so, I'm gonna go about conveying the truth in a way that's gonna be most effective. But also, one thing I guess I've known over the years from my academic study of the New Testament, but I haven't really applied it to this until I kind of wrote this chapter, is we see the New Testament writers tapping into the rhetorical devices of their day all over the place. Paul,
Yeah.
well known in Corinthians, he's using all kinds of rhetorical devices that were known to him in the first century. Galatians reads differently than Corinthians, reads differently than, Philemon. He's a lot more kind of
Yeah.
like Galatians. He's just apostolic here, hardcore. Philemon, he's like kind of like he's wanting Philemon to come to the truth on his own terms, kind of. He wants him to see it. So,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
Corinthians, he uses all kinds of sarcasm and all kinds of device. So he tapped into the resources available to him to not just preach the truth of the same way to every single person, but to do so in a way that is nuanced and careful, and he wants people to actually see the truth. So that's all I'm doing in this first chapter, trying to imitate
So, so why do you
that.
think it is that we, particularly Christians, evangelical Christians, particularly, why do you think we are so lousy at this? We, particularly think if we go back to the start of the pandemic, if we go back to 2016, whether it's politics
Yeah.
or COVID and vaccines or broken sexuality, I mean, we could have an endless parade of people talking about how their Thanksgiving dinners have been obliterated by bad conversations, right? Why do you think we
Uh,
are so lousy at having healthy conversations about difficult topics?
mhm. I don't know if I have some thoughts, but they're no more than just that. I actually think it is a human problem, not just a church problem. Where I get discouraged, I'm like, yeah, but the church, we have the resources to do it differently. Like when you see a political debate, I'm thinking back to like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, or whatever. You see any politician just slinging mud and dehumanizing and all this, just polarizing rhetoric. And it's almost like, okay, from a secular society, I would expect that's not shocking. It's
Right.
sad. It's like that's not how you treat one another. But it's not shocking. It's not shocking when you listen to Fox News and you end up just hating anybody on the left, and you listen to CNN, MSNBC, and you end up hating all these Republic. Like these forums are kind of designed. They're incentivizing anger, right? They're
Mm.
they're tapping into our anger, our bitterness, our fear, because these things keep you scrolling and clicking on ads. And I mean, that's a whole kind of that's a whole nother conversation. But I think
Right.
that there's
Yeah.
there is the way things are set up, very polarizing, very, not geared towards humanizing another person, loving your neighbor, loving your enemy. It's just sad to me when the church just adopts that very same posture in our
Yeah.
disputes, whether it's our political disputes or theological disputes. I mean, um, so yeah, I think we you asked the question, why are we so bad at it? I think maybe we're not. Yeah, I think we're being discipled by a broader, increasingly polarized culture, and we need to be more vigilant and not letting this polarization interrupt our discipleship. But
Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah,
Well, and some of it,
the pandemic. Were you a pastor during the pandemic? Were you still pastoring
yes,
at that time? I mean,
yes, and I
what was
live
that
I live to
like?
tell
Not to
about it.
turn it around, but every pastor I talked to says this was the most challenging, not just I mean, a pandemic itself's challenging, but just
Yeah.
the way it just blew up all these divisions and stuff. I mean, churches dividing over not the Trinity, not salvation by grace through faith, but like whether they should wear a mask or not or something.
Yeah,
Like, we're out of here, like,
a
oh,
6 by 4 piece of cotton, and so I
divided the bride of Christ.
yeah, and I can tell you, it just, um, uh, I was in a conversation with I was in a room with about 30 pastors, and we were probably 20 months or so post the start of COVID. So, we feel like we're coming through it to a certain extent at that point. But anyway, about 20, 30 pastors in the room at that point. And one of them said to the guys leading the conversation, he said, in all the 2, 3 decades, can't remember what he said, of leading a church, I've had the hardest and harshest things said to me as a pastor that I've ever heard. And then somebody else in the room piped up and said, "Hey, I've had exactly that experience, but I've had the harshest things said to me by my best, strongest, most core leaders in the church." And
Wow.
and everybody just kind of took a deep breath just like that. And so,
Wow.
for what it's worth, we seem to have gotten past a good bit of that. But a lot of this, a lot of times, we're lousy at things in terms of walking with the Lord the way we should because we're afraid, and a lot of that is
Yeah.
what this is. Now, before we
Hmm.
move on, I had a question for you on this. Uh,
Yeah.
Everybody has their critics. I'm sure you have yours. Um, but in this first part of the book, where you're relying on some of the work of Jonathan Haidt and others, somebody's going to say, "Well, Jonathan Haidt's not a believer. Why are you
Right.
using his work? How can that be helpful?" Uh, are you anticipating that kind of a pushback? If you are, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I at first I didn't, but as I was writing that chapter, I was like, oh yeah, certain people are not going to be convinced if I'm drawing on secular psychology. I mean, I was raised in an environment that didn't believe in secular psychology, like it's all
Right?
kind
Yeah.
of the devil, So, um, so I do have a short section in that chapter titled "Isn't this all secular psychobabble?" And I kind of
Yeah.
respond to the very question. So, yeah, my response, I guess, is twofold. Number one, I think our doctrine of general revelation al- allows us to see, to seek and find truth in, outside the church, outside of Christians. I think we can, you know, and again, this is disputed, but I think we can draw on secular psychology. Obviously, if they say something that conflicts with the biblical worldview, then we don't believe it. But I think all people are created in God's image. God reveals himself through creation, including other creatures,
Right.
Psalm 19, other passages, Acts 15, um, Romans 1 is a big one. So I would theologically, I would say, no, I think it's good and should be pursued to try to draw wisdom from outside outside the church, as long as it doesn't conflict with the biblical worldview. So that's part one. Part two would be just kind of what I said earlier, that we see biblical authors
Hmm.
doing that. When it comes
Right.
to not the content of the truth, we don't go to Plato to determine our beliefs, but we can use Plato, or I guess a better example would be Aristotle, on effective forms of communication.
Right.
Even our logical reasoning, our very hermeneutic. You might know this. I mean, our hermeneutics, which we learn in hermeneutics class, ultimately comes largely from Francis Bacon, who kind of came up with a lot of kind of interpretive principles that aren't Christian at all. I mean, they're just how to read a text, and
Right. Yeah.
and a lot of our exegesis is kind of drawing on some of those logical things that we do. So, um, yeah, so we have both biblical precedent to draw on secular psychology, and also just the doctrine of general revelation. I think allows us or even encourages us to do that.
Yeah, that's so good. So good. Well, the second part of the book is really very important as well because it gives really a theological foundation to understanding marriage. And when I was doing doctoral work in this area, this was one of the
Mm,
things I thought was really great, which is to move us past as Christians, uh, past a simple companionship idea about
mm,
marriage. That there's actually, in the Christian sense,
mhm,
something much, much bigger, something much, much deeper that I think most Christians really don't have a handle on, which is the uniqueness of Christian covenant marriage. And you kind of deal with this from the standpoint of what I think you use the term historical Christian view. I'd be curious
yeah.
why you use, some people would say, well, the biblical Christian view, or anyway, or the traditional or the conservative view.
Yeah,
Why did you use the
yeah,
historical Christian
yeah.
view, and then what do you mean by that?
That's a good. So I love that question, by the way. Because I've thought through this a lot. What is the best term to use? So yeah, I'm very intentional on the terms that I use, and I don't think there's any perfect term. Biblical. It's I don't mind that as long as I get to define it, but it can also be, well, in my experience, people throw around the term biblical to
Mm,
rubber stamp their beliefs.
right,
Or the term biblical can be synonymous with just kind of conservative theological doctrines.
right.
Or even maybe, and when I say conservative, I mean both theologically and maybe politically even. So sometimes we adopt
Sometimes.
political views that just aren't in the Bible, and it's like, so I actually think biblical does have baggage in how it's being used. I should go without saying, anybody who's read me for more than 5 seconds, the authority of Scripture is by hands down, that's the foundation for everything. So personally, I wouldn't have that. I think it's biblical. Yeah, absolutely. But the way the term's used, I think it can kind of cause an eye roll among other people when you say
Hmm.
biblical, and because it's been used, I think, in an unhealthy way. Also, some people pointed out, well, we have polygamy in the Bible. Does that mean that's biblical? It's in the Bible. We
Right.
have, a brother-in-law marrying, raising up a seed, for his, what is it? His brother,
His sister-in-law.
his
Yeah.
brother's wife, or what? Yeah, the Levirate law. I'm blanking on the exact formula, but there's
Yep.
certain things in the Bible regarding marriage that we say, oh yeah, that's not biblical. It's in the Bible. So,
Yeah.
um, I do use traditional view of marriage sometimes. I'm okay with that as long as we don't understand that we believe it simply because it's our tradition.
Mm, right.
Historically Christian to me is the one that has the least baggage and is, um, I think, the better of the various options. I don't like conservative marriage either because the word conservative is just so political that I just try.
Right.
I avoid
Yeah.
conservative as much as I can.
Yeah.
Um, so historically Christian, historically Christians have believed that sex difference is part of what marriage is, and that same-sex sexual relationships are forbidden in every scenario by God. So I'm not rubber stamping everything Christians have said about marriage and sex historically, and I address that in the chapter. That I don't mean
Right.
historically everything, but specifically when it comes to, is sex difference necessary for marriage, and does God ever allow for same-sex sexual relationships? The global, one might say, multi-ethnic, multi-denominational church for nearly 2,000 years, as far as we can tell, didn't question those two core doctrines. So I think historically Christian or historical Christian is the best of the options.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well.
so yeah, so I lay out five. Well, yeah, I'll keep this short, but the main, um, I guess I already said it. The main essential question is sex difference part of what marriage is? Um, and is sex, has God designed sex to belong within that covenant of marriage? So I'm not even, I can say all that without even mentioning homosexuality or whatever, because I'm ultimately trying to say, what is marriage? What is it for? And what is God's design for sexual relationships? So, yeah, so I do think that the Bible teaches that marriage is a union between two people of different biological sexes, and that sexual relationships should be limited to that covenant union, is the most succinct way I could put it.
So, see if we can try to bring this out of the theological cloud a little bit. When you say that sex difference is intrinsic uh,
Yeah.
to uh, a a view, a biblical historical view of marriage, why is sex difference
Mhm.
intrinsic or necessary to that understanding of marriage?
So that's a complicated, not unclear, but it's a very complex question. It goes to, what is the purpose of marriage in the first place?
Mm.
And I do talk about this toward the end of the chapter, kind of, and this is something that Christians have wrestled with historically. What is the purpose of marriage? Is marriage, um, is it a lesser vocation than singleness? Some early church fathers kind of,
Right.
they kind of have a negative view in marriage. They still believe sex difference is part of what marriage is, but they kind of look at marriage as like the lesser vocation than
Yeah,
singleness.
which
Um,
is an ironic way when like I said, I've pastored evangelical churches primarily in the suburbs of big cities, and in the city where I live today, it's very hard to be a single Christian.
mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think we, at least in my lifetime as a Christian since the '80s. it's almost like we've unintentionally idolatrized
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
the whole married with 2.5 kids and the white picket fence. Um, and
Yeah,
what
I
we've
agree,
done,
and I think.
yeah, and what we've done
Go
is we
ahead, go
made
ahead.
it very difficult to be um, legitimized in the local church as a single person. I'm thinking of a couple of people that I know that are single in the church that I pastored. But that's the ironic way of reading, particularly 1 Corinthians 7, right? Where Paul
Mhm.
basically, in my understanding, he approaches this as, okay, what's God calling you to? Is he calling you to be
Yeah.
single, or is he calling you to be married? Both of them are
Mhm.
callings.
Yeah.
You just need to figure out which one you're called to. And he, at least by volume of material in 1 Corinthians 7, the larger affirmation goes to those who are
Mm.
single.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems to be one of the ways you can read that chapter, right, is that the Corinthians were saying, hey, this all this sex stuff is so messed up and so corrupt. Wouldn't we be more spiritual if we just left all of it behind and we were all single? And that may
Yeah.
be the way that they were posing the question to Paul.
Yeah.
Others would debate that, but that may be one way. But you do a good job of pointing out that there's a strong tradition in the Christian church that singleness is a highly noble way to live, and a fulfilling way to live, right?
Absolutely, yeah, I mean, Christianity stands out as very unique among religions, in elevating singleness as high as it did, to my knowledge. I mean, I feel free to fact check me on all on this, but as far as I know, I mean, the biblical view of the New Testament view of singleness is really unique, especially in that day and age. So yeah, and I think we've very much underappreciated that, and I think we have to be careful in how sometimes when we, 'cause I use the phrase, idolatry of marriage and elevating singleness, and some people think I'm speaking negatively of marriage, and to me, it's like I'm not. I think marriage is an incredibly high calling, and I want to preserve God's design for marriage. I don't want to bring that down to where singleness is. I want to bring singleness up to say this is an
Right.
equally valid um, calling, and Paul's even borders on border maybe to say it's better to it's not wrong
Yeah.
to be married, but if you really want to live it up for the kingdom, the single life's where it's at. So and Jesus was single, and we all know that, but I don't know if we appreciate the theological implications of that. And some people say, well, he was a sinless son of God. He couldn't have gotten married. And I'm like, so you're saying marriage is a sin? Isn't that a
Yeah.
Genesis 2 pre-fall? And I don't claim to have the answer, but I think that I think Jesus was saying something really powerful by his very singleness. So, um, yeah, going back, what was you? You raised a question though that I was gonna. Oh, the purpose of marriage. Like, why is sex difference? I talk about three different kind of purposes of marriage. The main one would be procreation.
Right.
And I
Obviously.
think
Yeah.
God designed marriage to be the location where offspring would be produced and raised, and sex difference is necessary both for producing the offspring and for, by extension, reflect the creator's design for raising that offspring. And so you put all that together, and that's kind of the obvious one. Like sex difference is an essential part of that. I also think you see throughout Scripture human marriage being used as almost like a metaphor, a symbol of God's love for His people,
Right.
Yahweh toward Israel, Christ and the bride. And even there, I would say that sex difference in the marriage metaphor is necessary to make that metaphor to make it work, really.
Hmm.
And this gets into complicated, just Christ and the bride and the man and the woman. I mean, the man is Jesus and the woman is the the church. So it raises some questions within that. But if we just stand back 30,000 foot level, it does seem that um, if marriage was a sexless institution, we would have to kind of it would mess with the metaphors that are so
Right.
essential to the biblical storyline. The one purpose of marriage, another one I discuss, is companionship. You see in the Song of Songs, hardly even mentions offspring. Some people say there's no
Right.
mention of
Yeah.
procreation. There's a lot of romance, a lot of intimacy, a lot of sexual intimacy, two people enjoying each other, and And some people would say that, two people of the same sex can do that, right? Companionship. And I would say, yeah, I think they could. But that's not the only purpose of marriage. In our modern culture, we kind of say it's all about romance and consensuality, but the
Right.
Bible just doesn't. It is that, but it's more than that. So, um,
Yeah. And kind of
yeah,
goes,
I mean, procreation is to me the big one, though.
yeah, but that to that point, it goes back to the idea that of Jesus being choosing to be single and yet experiencing the highest levels of connection,
Hmm.
what he prays about in terms of oneness
Mm,
in John 17. He experienced the greatest levels of oneness both with God as his heavenly Father, but also with other human beings, with his apostles in a completely
mm,
non-romantic, sexless kind of way. Jesus knew how to build relationships without sexual
mm,
engagement, which kind of goes to this interesting point that you make that marriage, and this is really countercultural in some ways to the American culture, that marriage and sex are not essential for human flourishing.
yeah.
And our culture just really struggles with that point. Although you may be seeing this as we are with some of the work in Gen Z. Gen Z is kind of saying, you know what? I don't have to run after all that. They're in some
Yeah.
polls, they're delaying their experiences with
Yeah.
sex. They're certainly delaying their pursuit of marriage.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and some of that is not for biblical reasons. It's because they're disillusioned with all of it. They've been so
Yeah.
saturated with it, but they've lost some of the enchantment around it.
Huh.
But it does open up the conversation that, you know what, you can have a very full and flourishing life without being married and without ever having sex.
Yeah.
And most people in
So
our culture
it's so
don't accept
yeah.
that.
Y It's so counterintuitive if you're just bathing in the cultural paradigm. And when I say culture, I mean both secular culture and church culture, we do kind of at least I grew up and you probably grew up too, just it was just kind of it's just kind of assumed that,
Right? Yeah.
you follow Jesus and you don't go past first base with your girlfriend and God will reward you
Yeah.
with this amazing spouse, your soulmate. You're gonna have a flourishing sexual life. Just wait, wait. And if you wait, it's kind of like this transactional, and God will bless you. But there's not a single verse that supports that. And while it's true that I would say the majority of humans will probably get married, and I don't want to deny, the joys that come with romantic and sexual intimacy, but yeah, I think just theologically and practically, um, yeah, I don't think you need to be married and have sex to flourish as an individual human being. And that's an important caveat. Obviously, for humanity to flourish, it needs people to be married and having offspring. Otherwise, we'd die out. But for each individual, um, that's not necessary. In fact, it can be really destructive when we explicitly or implicitly give people the impression that if you just follow God well, He will bless you with a partner that satisfies your desires, because
Right.
that's it's great until it doesn't happen, or you think it happens, and then 2 years into marriage, you're like, this ain't happening, or 7 years, or I mean, um, yeah. So I think we do need to cultivate a more robust biblical there we go view of um yeah, God's design for marriage, including not idolizing it. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we need a big installment of the theology of marriage and
mhm.
some better thinking. And like you said, I've heard you refer to this, and that means sometimes leaning on some of our friends from the Catholic tradition. They've
Yeah,
in some ways done some more thinking on this that we would learn from.
yeah.
But there is some great work out there and some fresh thinking going on that we would do well to embrace. And again, it's
Mhm.
just so important to kind of know what you're arguing for if you're going to be in conversations where people don't agree with you. And a
Right.
lot of this, just thinking through this with you, that a lot of the folks that we are talking with and may have opportunity to talk with that are coming from different viewpoints, they have some thinking to do on their own. It's not like they've gone to some kind of big catechism where they've been trained
Mhm.
uh, to really disassemble this
Mhm.
historic view. A lot of it is driven by emotion. A lot of it is driven by.
Mhm.
Um, I love in the first part of the book you talk about. Hey, just think about if the person you're talking to or you were to significantly change your position, what would that do to all the relationships around you?
Yeah.
What would happen to the
Yeah.
emotional reality and the communal reality, of what your world would become, right?
Yeah.
And the number
Yeah.
one thing people are really concerned about is loneliness. There's a reason why the Bible says it's not good for us to be alone.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but you get to the last part, these 21 conversations, and a
Mhm.
lot of people, I could envision a number of people I know rushing to this part of the book. They just skip
Yeah.
over the first part and they say, okay, give me the explanations that I want to have with my coworker or with my
Yeah.
Gen Z college age child, right? Um, Tell us about that part of the book and um, how
Mhm.
you would want people to engage with that part.
Yeah, so I'm fine with people jumping ahead and reading chapters, but what I do tell them is read the first two foundations, the first two chapters. Like those are essential because I'm assuming a lot of stuff we talked about there when I get to the 21 arguments. So yeah,
Right,
at least do that. And it's not terribly long. So um, and one of the when I over the years I've kept a mental list of all the main pushbacks I've gotten over the years regarding traditional marriage. So that's what those 21 um short chapters are is my response to all the what about this, what about that, what about this, now in those chapters I call them conversations. I just
right,
make it more I could say arguments, but then again it's not. I want to kind of wean people off kind of thinking an argument is just argumentative,
right.
that kind of spirit that I'm trying to wean people off of. So conversations, um one thing I talk about in the opening chapter though is can you find some point of agreement
Mm,
in the argument you're trying to think through and perhaps refute. Okay. And so I try to take my own advice there. And so the 21 chapters are set up in three parts. Number one, I briefly summarize the argument. Um, and I try extremely hard to what I call steel man rather than straw man, but
mm,
steel man of the other viewpoint. Can I so well represent it that somebody who actually believes in that argument would say, "Yep, that's exactly what I would say. That is my viewpoint." Like I want to accurately represent the viewpoint. I don't want to straw man it. And then the second short part, just maybe paragraph, is what are some points of agreement I might have with this argument? And I do. In every single one, I try to find something that I can say, that's a good point. Oh, I resonate with that perspective. And then I give a more lengthy, okay, within that, here's my response, which is more of a critical, slash refutation of the argument. Um, yeah, so that's how it's set up. So some of those are, they deal with some really technical academic stuff. I really tried to still make it accessible and readable. Other ones are very kind of just not really academic, kind of like love is love,
yeah, yeah,
or there's another one, if God made some people gay, then why would he say it's not okay to be in a
yeah.
same sex relationship? So those are more, on the relational, maybe even psychological side. But the others are dealing with like this Greek word, has been mistranslated or something, So it's a range of, more in depth. Some are a little lighter. Um, yeah,
Well, let's take an example. Just jump into one
sure.
of these, which is, and I've heard this argument from friends, right? Which is, hey, the Bible didn't know anything like we know today. We're modern, sophisticated people. We've advanced to the place of understanding human development, and the Bible just didn't have any grasp of what we understand today about sexual orientation and so the Bible never spoke to it because it just the people were too primitive in their understanding to be able to think that way. We've now advanced as a society and as a culture to where we now understand orientation, sexuality much
Mhm,
better, and
mhm.
that's why the biblical historical view is no longer relevant.
Yeah,
How do
that's a
you
good.
respond
That's
to that?
a good. Wow, that's a good summary. That's a good summary. Yeah, to just add a quick thought, some people say, if Paul knew what we knew today, that some people are simply born
Yeah,
with an innate, unchangeable sexual orientation, he wouldn't have said the things he did. So we need to uh, kind of reread the Bible, read the Bible as this ancient text, but we can improve upon maybe its thinking on this topic because we now have better knowledge. So
Right.
Points of agreement. Yeah, sure, it's true. Absolutely, it's true that we know a lot more about human sexuality, how the brain and body works. We know about um, how different life experiences can shape us sexually. We know how certain traumatic events can affect our sexuality, and yeah, we know that for whatever reason, some people have unchosen attraction to the same sex. And that's just it's complicated. Where'd it come from? What caused it? Is that nature, nurture, and all these questions? So yeah, we've got a lot more maybe in depth knowledge of human sexuality. Um, and I don't want to just project that on the Apostle Paul, as if Paul would be, very familiar with like the American Psychological Association's statement on sexuality. Like
Right.
obviously
Yeah.
he didn't have that knowledge. Now, I would quickly turn to corner and say, I want to be careful being overly confident that our current knowledge now is all that amazing. Like
Mm.
there can be. I think C.S. Lewis talks about chronological snobbery, that like, well, we those backwoods ancient people that didn't know anything, we have all this enlightened knowledge. I'm like, yeah, we're kind of messed up too, and our enlightened knowledge keeps shifting and changing, and who knows what we'll think in 20 years about sexual orientation. So let's at least
Right.
keep that a little bit with an open hand too. Like we're not maybe as enlightened as we think we are. The big one for me though is as a biblical scholar and historian, is historically speaking, while the modern concept of sexual orientation in its current form, you don't see exact statements like that in the ancient world, but you do see many ancient texts talking about how some people are born with an innate desire for the same sex in terms of some kind of sexual desire. Like it's just kind of,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of I don't want to get too technical, but they're astrological text where people would kind of read the signs in the sky, and if someone's born under this constellation, then they would be born basically desiring the same sex. Which
Mm.
I'm not validating that on a scientific level, but I'm saying they had categories that
Right.
some people were innately wired for the same sex. So did Paul believe that? Did he know about it? I don't know. What we can't say though is historically these categories didn't even exist in the ancient world. We can't say that historically. Well, there were categories similar to what we would call sexual orientation in the ancient world. So I guess quickly, I don't I think this argument assumes that an innate desire would should validate inaction. In other
Mm.
words, we determine whether an action is correct or not based on, is it the byproduct of an innate strong desire? Okay, but that's not how biblical ethics work. No biblical writer reasons that way. Like,
Right. Yeah.
beginning with the sort of holiness of the innate desire and then saying whatever that desire is, the action must be okay. It begins with evaluating, does a certain behavior, a certain action resonate with God's design? And then it's kind of like, I don't want to say, I mean, it's almost like irrelevant whether you desire it or not. Like that doesn't determine whether the thing is good or not. So,
Right.
yeah,
Which is completely counter to the way we see a lot of thinking going on in our culture, which is
very
with
counter.
this idea that all truth is subjective, and therefore all truth is personal, and therefore whatever I want to do sexually is completely up to me, because nobody really can have a real handle on anything called objective truth, and so it's just my truth versus your truth, and that's where a
Yeah.
lot of our thinking is going at this point.
Mhm.
We do a
Yeah.
lot of conversations here, Preston, at Denison Forum around the idea that holding to a historical view, historical Christian view of marriage is, in many people's minds today, at best naive, and in
Mhm.
other people's minds is actually dangerous and damaging to other people.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
what would you say about that, and about
Mhm.
Christians who are concerned about that? We now,
Yeah.
obviously we had the Supreme Court and the Obergefell decision. We're now seeing, even recently, the former mayor of New York saying that he's going to open up his 30-year marriage
Mm.
into consensual non-monogamy, I believe is the way the writer or
Yeah.
reporter described it.
Yeah.
Um, and again, this whole idea that what has for centuries now been the historic Christian view, now looked upon as not just maybe irrelevant, but actually damaging and dangerous to people.
Yeah.
Do you have concerns in that direction?
Yeah, so that's I think it's I addressed that in chapter 19. Is the traditional view of marriage harmful towards gay and lesbian people? And there's another argument in a different chapter. Are we on the wrong side of history? So what you're bringing up is kind of a
Yeah.
blend of both of those.
Yep.
So there's kind of different responses. So points of agreement. First of all, and you know the stories yourself. I mean, has the church, have Christians done things that have been damaging and harmful towards LGBT people? Absolutely. A big part of my ministry is trying to help the church to not do that, you know?
Mm.
Sometimes it's unintentional. We just use words or we say things we don't realize are just really offensive and shameful, and, sometimes it is intentional. We're just saying things that are really rude and obnoxious, and
Right.
so to me, that's yeah, has there been harm done? Yes, absolutely. But the specific question is that harm based on simply believing in a historically Christian view of marriage? And that's where I'm like, okay, so now we're taking this observation of harm done towards LGBT people, and now we're using it as part of an intellectual argument. So that's when I'm gonna, okay, well, let's evaluate the logical consistency or biblical consistency of that argument. So um yeah, so to p state my conclusion, I don't think simply believing that sex difference is part of what marriage is, and that all sexual relationships belong within that covenant bond. I don't think that that belief necessitates me doing harmful things towards gay and lesbian people like that. If that is my response, then there's that's not intrinsic to the doctrine. That's
Right.
my misreading of it. That's my humanity, my flesh doing something wrong with it. So we do need to logicians often talk about, correlation versus causation. Just because two things can be correlated doesn't necessarily mean one is causing the other. Do Christians who hold to a traditional view, do they sometimes do harmful things? Absolutely. But that's correlation. We need to show that it's their traditional belief that's causing that. And I think that'd be a hard thing to show anyway. But yeah, so I addressed that pretty thoroughly in the book. I even sometimes people cite certain sociological studies that have been appealed to show that gay and lesbian people, when they're in non-affirming religious environments, then it increases their suicidality, depression, self-harm, all these things. So I actually looked at a lot of those studies, and I think they're largely used either out of context, or they're cherry picking certain studies to back up that point. I've read many studies done along these lines, and some are better than others. Some come to different conclusions. One study said it was on the happiness of LGBT people, and the authors of the study were shocked that religious LGBT people demonstrated higher levels of happiness than non-religious LGBT people, and they even said it didn't matter whether the religious context was more progressive or more conservative.
Mm.
They were shocked at that. We also see in some some of the most progressive environments, like the Scandinavian countries, Holland and others in that area, that gay and lesbian youth have much higher rates of self-harm, depression, suicidality than older gay and lesbian people of the same society. So
Mm.
if you think about that, like here's a very accepting society that is getting more and more accepting. You would expect, if it's simply, you know, society that's making it harmful, that it's causing unhappiness among gay and lesbian people, you would expect to see those rates going down, not up. So then it raises a
Right.
question, well,
Sure.
maybe simply being accepted and affirmed, which again lesbian people do all over the place in these countries. Maybe that's not enough to produce happiness and flourishing. So, so it's a yeah, it's a very complicated uh, argument, and I would say at the heart of this argument is often a story, and this is where
Mm.
I wouldn't race to the studies, wouldn't race to, repeating everything I said here to refute an argument. I would really want to get to know, why is somebody raising this? Have they had a bad experience? Have they been mistreated by another Christian?
Right.
Usually there's a story behind the argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, really great stuff. I wish we could talk about all 21 conversations because I know I've been in some of those conversations, and there's a really great importance to kind of think your way through all of that. But we're about out of time. The book is Preston Sprinkle, Does the Bible Support Same-Sex Marriage? 21 Conversations from a Historically Christian View. It'll be available at all the major booksellers, right?
Mm. Yep,
And
yep. You
also
can pre-order
available.
it on Amazon.
Yep, and also available on your own website. It's the Center for Faith, or is it Center for Faith, Gender, and Sexuality? Give me the right website.
Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender is the name. The website is simply centerforfaith.com.
Okay,
Yeah,
and
easy
you
to
can check
find.
out Preston's new book as well as his other work, and I highly, highly recommend it. Very, very helpful in every way. Preston, thank you for making room for the conversation, and we pray that God will just continue to bless your work, your books, your writing. Very, very helpful, joyful, and clarifying. And I'm a big fan. I know others are as well. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. Thank you to our audience. If this has been helpful to you, please rate, review us on your podcast platform, share it with family and friends, help them to find the conversation as well. And we'll see you next time on the Denison Forum podcast.